He spent 30 years hiding his heart until a flight attendant made him believe in love again. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The morning light spilled through the oval windows of Flight AA1424, painting golden streaks across Seat 4A. Margot Ellis smoothed her navy blue uniform, her fingers lingering on the silver wings pinned to her lapel. After 12 years as a flight attendant, she'd mastered the art of reading passengers before they even spoke. The man in 4A, however, was different. He sat absolutely still, like a photograph come to life, his silver-streaked dark hair catching the sunrise. While other passengers furiously tapped their phones before takeoff, he held a worn, leather-bound notebook, his pen hovering above an empty page. There was something in his stillness that spoke of practice, years of perfecting the art of taking up as little space as possible in a world that suddenly felt too big. "Coffee, sir." Margot's voice carried its usual warmth, practiced but genuine. When he looked up, the unexpected depth in his hazel eyes caught her off guard. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and said too little. "Thank you." His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if grateful for the interruption of his thoughts. "Black, please." As she poured, turbulence rattled the aircraft. Coffee splashed over the cup's rim, speckling the man's notebook. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Margot quickly reached for her napkin, but he was already dabbing at the drops with his sleeve. "No harm done," he said, offering a smile that seemed to surprise even himself. The pages needed some character anyway. Margot noticed his hands, steady, ink-stained fingers that spoke of years spent crafting words. "Are you a writer?" "An editor, actually. Emery Caldwell." He paused, as if the name felt foreign on his tongue. "Though these days, I mostly read other people's dreams and try to help them take flight." Something in his choice of words made Margot's heart skip. She'd spent years collecting passengers, stories, writing them down in her own secret notebook during lonely nights in distant hotels. Stories of love found and lost, of chances taken and missed, of hearts broken and mended. "That must be fascinating," she said, meaning it. "Helping others find their voice." Sometimes, Emery's fingers traced the edge of his notebook. "Though lately, I've been wondering if I've forgotten the sound of my own." The confession hung in the air between them, unexpected and raw. Before Margot could respond, the call button chimed from the back of the plane. "Excuse me," she said, reluctantly stepping away. Throughout the flight, Margot found her gaze drawn back to Seat 4A. Emery hadn't written a single word in his notebook, but his eyes followed her movements with quiet attention. She recognized something in his solitude that echoed her own, the careful distance she'd maintained since David's betrayal 3 years ago, when she'd found him with Rachel, her best friend since college. During meal service, she noticed Emery helping an elderly passenger open her container of fruit, his movements gentle and assured. It was the kind of kindness that came from muscle memory, from years of caring for someone else. Later, she saw him slide his window shade halfway down when the sun began to bother the young mother next to him, all without a word, as if kindness worked better in silence. As the plane began its descent into Savannah, golden light once again flooded the cabin. Margot made her final rounds, collecting trash and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. When she reached 4A, Emery handed her his empty coffee cup, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you," he said, and somehow she knew he meant more than just the coffee. "For what it's worth," Margot found herself saying, "sometimes the best voices are the ones that have been quiet for a while. They've had time to learn what really matters." Something shifted in Emery's eyes, a spark of recognition, perhaps, or the first crack in a wall built 30 years ago. He opened his mouth to respond, but the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their final approach. As the plane touched down in Savannah, Margot couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened at 30,000 feet. She'd spent years helping others reach their destinations, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be arriving somewhere herself. What she didn't know then was that this flight was just the beginning, that sometimes the heart finds its way home on an ordinary Tuesday morning, somewhere between New York and Savannah, between coffee spills and unwritten words, between who we were and who we might become. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most important journeys start with a simple cup of coffee in seat 4A. Margot's tiny apartment in Brooklyn Heights felt especially empty after long flights. Tonight, the sound of rain against her windows created a rhythm that matched her typing, swift, then hesitant, then swift again. Her laptop screen illuminated a wall covered in post-it notes, each one carrying fragments of conversations and moments stolen from the sky. "Tell me about love at 65, read one note in her careful handwriting. "My Harold waited 40 years to find me. Dear, sometimes the heart needs decades to prepare for its greatest adventure." Another yellow square held just 3 words: Seat 4A, remember. Margot's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She'd been writing her book in secret for 2 years now, stealing moments between flights to capture the stories that passengers had entrusted to her. But tonight, she couldn't stop thinking about the quiet editor with ink-stained fingers and eyes that held 3 decades of silence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucy, her lead flight attendant and closest friend. "Did you send it?" Lucy's message glowed accusingly. Margot glanced at the email draft she'd prepared. The submission to Riverside Publishing had been ready for days, but her finger refused to hit send. "Not yet," she typed back. "Margot Ellis, if you don't send that manuscript tonight, I'm coming over there and doing it myself. You're ready." "The stories are ready." Before she could respond, another message popped up. "Remember what that old lady told you on the Tokyo flight. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about letting your hands shake and doing it anyway." Margot smiled, remembering the grandmother who dispensed that wisdom while knitting a baby blanket for a grandchild she was flying to meet for the first time. That story was in Chapter 3. Taking a deep breath, she opened her manuscript one last time. Wings of paper, stories collected at 30,000 feet, glowed at the top of the page. With trembling fingers, she attached the file to her email and pressed send before she could change her mind. Across town, in a brownstone that felt too big for one person, Emery Caldwell sat in his study surrounded by manuscripts. The room smelled of old books and coffee, with just a hint of the lavender sachets Claire used to tuck between the shelves. Even after 30 years, he couldn't bring himself to change that detail. His phone lit up with a message from his assistant at Riverside Publishing. "Emergency submission just came in. Publisher wants your eyes on it first thing tomorrow. Apparently, it's something special." Emery sighed, reaching for his reading glasses. The word special had lost its meaning after 20 years of publishing, yet something made him open his laptop anyway. Perhaps it was the memory of kind eyes and a gentle voice asking about his notebook. He hadn't written a word that day, but for the first time in years, he'd wanted to. The manuscript's title caught his attention immediately: Wings of Paper, stories collected at 30,000 feet. The author was listed simply as M.E. The first paragraph reached out and grabbed him by the throat. "We think we know people by their destinations, but it's in the journey that their true stories emerge. At 30,000 feet, somewhere between departure and arrival, between who we were and who we're becoming, strangers trust flight attendants with their secrets. These are the stories they've shared with me, written on napkins, whispered over midnight coffee, offered in moments when the earth seems far enough away to make truth feel safer." Emery's hand shook slightly as he reached the end of the first page. The voice was clear, honest, and hauntingly familiar. He read until dawn, painted his study walls the same gold as that morning's flight, unable to shake the feeling that he knew this mysterious M.E. The next morning, Margot stood in her galley on a flight to Chicago, trying to focus on preparing the breakfast service. Her phone was turned off, sealed away in her crew bag. but she could almost feel it buzzing with potential responses from the publisher. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her manuscript, her heart bound in digital pages, sitting in someone's inbox, waiting to be judged. "Oh, you seem distracted today," observed her colleague Ben, sliding past her with a coffee pot. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," Margot lied, arranging pastries on her cart, but her mind kept drifting to the stories she'd collected. The widow flying to scatter her husband's ashes in his hometown, the teenage boy traveling to meet his birth mother, the quiet editor in 4A whose sadness felt like a story waiting to be told. The intercom crackled. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." As Margot secured the cabin for arrival, she thought about all the passengers who'd trusted her with their stories. They'd given her their truth. Maybe it was time she trusted the world with theirs. Her phone chirped the moment she turned it on after landing. One new email from Riverside Publishing. "Dear Ms. Nellis, your manuscript has captured our attention in a way few submissions do. We would like to schedule a meeting with your assigned editor as soon as possible. Given the unique nature of your work, we've selected one of our most experienced editors to guide this project. Mr. Emery Caldwell will be handling your book personally." Margot's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, splashing across the crew room floor. Just like that morning in the sky, she found herself reaching for napkins, trying to contain a mess that felt bigger than coffee stains. Because somewhere in her manuscript was the story of a quiet man in Seat 4A, and now that same man would be reading every word she'd written about the moment their paths had crossed among the clouds. The Riverside Publishing building stood like a weathered lighthouse among Manhattan's gleaming towers, its red brick facade a stubborn reminder of a more romantic era of publishing. Margot stood before its revolving doors, her manuscript clutched to her chest like a shield. She'd changed her outfit 3 times that morning, finally settling on a coral dress that made her feel more like a writer and less like the woman who still flinched when she saw happy couples on the street. Inside her bag, her phone buzzed with Lucy's 10th text of the morning. "You've got this, storyteller. Remember, he's just another passenger whose story you need to understand." But Emery Caldwell wasn't just another passenger, and they both knew it. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt longer than any flight she'd ever worked. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a maze of bookshelves and the sound of muffled conversations behind closed doors. A young assistant led her through the labyrinth, stopping before a corner office with a view of Trinity Church's spire. "Mr. Caldwell will be with you shortly," the assistant said, ushering her inside. The office was exactly what she'd imagined during her sleepless nights since receiving his email. Walls lined with books, manuscripts stacked in precise towers, and a large desk that seemed to float in a pool of morning light. But what caught her attention was a small silver frame, turned face down beside his computer. Before she could wonder about it, the door opened. Emery stopped short when he saw her, recognition flickering across his face like lightning in distant clouds. He wore a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look both distinguished and vulnerable, and his fingers still bore traces of ink. "Ms. Ellis," he said softly, and hearing her name in his voice made her heart stumble. "I thought it might be you remembered. The coffee stains on my notebook wouldn't let me forget." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he moved to his desk, maintaining a careful distance. "And although I admit I didn't expect to find your stories on my desk 3 days later," Margot sat in the chair across from him, smoothing her dress. "If I had known you'd be my editor, I might have chosen a different publishing house, because of what I read about myself." The question hung between them like turbulence waiting to happen. Margot's throat tightened. "You've finished the manuscript?" "Twice." Emery reached for a folder, his movements deliberate. "Your writing, it has a rare quality. You don't just observe people, you see them. Every story feels like a confession wrapped in grace." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of her manuscript. "Except the one about the editor in Seat 4A. That one feels like a mirror." "I can remove it," Margot offered quickly. It was presumptuous to... "No." The word came out sharper than he seemed to intend. "No," he said again, Softer. It stays. But I need to know something. He finally met her eyes fully. Did you write it before or after you knew who I was? Before, she whispered. I write them all the night after each flight, when the moments are still fresh, still honest. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. He opened her manuscript to a marked page. You wrote, "Some people carry their silence like a well-loved book, pages dog-eared, with memories they can't bear to read again. How did you know?" The same way I know when a passenger needs an extra blanket or a moment of quiet. Some hurts are universal. Margot leaned forward slightly. Mr. Caldwell, Emery, he corrected. I think we're past formalities, given that you've already written my story. Emery, she tried again, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. I understand if you want to assign another editor to my book. He was already shaking his head. Do you know why I became an editor? Without waiting for her answer, he stood and walked to his window. I spent 30 years trying to edit my own story, trying to find the right words to explain why Claire's death left me unable to write another word. But some stories can't be edited. They can only be lived. Margot watched as he absently touched the wedding ring he still wore. And my story. What did you think when you read it? Emery turned back to her, his eyes carrying the weight of both professional judgment and personal understanding. I think you've written a beautiful book about other people's love stories because you're afraid to write your own. The truth of his words hit her like unexpected turbulence. Images of David and Rachel flashed through her mind, the engagement ring still warm from her finger being slipped onto her best friend's hand, the matching honeymoon tickets she'd found in David's email, addressed to Rachel instead of her. Maybe some stories are better left unwritten, she managed. And no, Emery returned to his desk, pulling out a red pen. Some stories just need the right editor. He opened her manuscript to the first page. Shall we begin? For the next 2 hours, they worked through her chapters, his insights sharp but gentle, his questions pushing her to dig deeper into each passenger's story. But they both carefully avoided discussing the chapter about him, letting it sit between them like an unopened letter. As their meeting drew to a close, Emery walked her to the elevator. In the narrow hallway, away from the professional distance of his office, she could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that reminded her of old books. Same time next week? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Margot nodded, stepping into the elevator. As the doors began to close, she caught a glimpse of him reaching up to touch the spot on his chest, where a wedding ring would hang on a chain, a gesture she'd noticed during their flight, but hadn't understood until now. In the lobby, her phone buzzed with a text from Lucy. How did it go? Margot stared at the screen, remembering Emery's words about stories that can't be edited, only lived. I think, she typed slowly, I just met someone who reads between the lines. I didn't know I was writing. 3 weeks of editing sessions had created a routine that felt dangerously comfortable. Every Wednesday afternoon, Margot would arrive at Riverside Publishing with a fresh cup of coffee for Emery, black, no sugar, and he would have a new set of post-it notes decorating her manuscript, each one filled with his elegant handwriting. Today, however, was different. When Margot stepped into his office, Emery was on the phone, his back to the door. His shoulders were tense, his free hand gripping the window frame as if to steady himself. I understand, Dr. Walsh, he was saying. Yes, I still have her letter. 28 years is a long time to keep something unread, isn't it? A pause. Thank you for thinking of me for the Memorial Garden project. Claire would have loved that. Margot started to step back out, but a floorboard creaked beneath her feet. Emery turned, and something raw and vulnerable flashed across his face before he could hide it. I have to go, he said into the phone. My 3 o'clock is here. The silence that followed felt heavy with unasked questions. Margot set his coffee on the desk, pretending not to notice how his hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. We could reschedule, she offered softly. No. Emery shook his head, pulling himself back into the present. Work helps. Besides, he gestured to her manuscript, open to chapter 7. We need to talk about the grandmother on the Tokyo flight. They settled into their usual positions, Emery behind his desk, Margot in what she'd come to think of as her chair. But today, the professional distance between them felt like a thin veil, easily torn by the weight of their unspoken stories. "You've captured her voice perfectly," Emery said, indicating a passage. "The way she talked about knitting that baby blanket, how every stitch was a prayer for a grandchild she hadn't met. But I think there's more here than just her story." "What do you mean?" "The way you wrote about her hands, age-spotted but sure, weaving love into every loop and whirl. It feels personal, like you're remembering someone else's hands." Margot's throat tightened. She thought of her father's hands, calloused from years of carpentry work, showing her how to build a birdhouse when she was 7. Before he walked away from their family, before the divorce papers arrived with his signature already dried, before 20 years of silence stretched between them like an ocean. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "we write the stories we wish we could change." Emery's eyes softened with understanding. He reached for his red pen but didn't uncap it. "Tell me about them, the hands you're really writing about." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it automatically, then felt the color drain from her face. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. "Margot, it's your father. I'm in New York. The doctors gave me 6 months. I'd like to see you." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto Emery's desk. He reached for it instinctively, his eyes catching the message before he could stop himself. "Margot, we should focus on Chapter 7. She cut him off, her voice tight. You mentioned something about the pacing in the 3rd paragraph." But Emery was already standing, moving around his desk to sit in the chair beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "When Claire was diagnosed," he said quietly, "I thought if I worked enough, edited enough manuscripts, kept myself busy enough, I could edit out the ending I knew was coming. I edited 16 books that year. None of them could change her story." "This is different," Margot whispered, but her voice betrayed her. "Is it? You filled your book with other people's reconciliations, reunions, second chances. Maybe it's time to write your own." "I haven't seen him in 20 years, Emery. He left when I was 12, moved to California, started a new family. He didn't even come to my high school graduation. And now he has 6 months. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of time, both wasted and remaining. Margot stood abruptly, walking to the window. The city sprawled below, millions of stories playing out in offices and apartments, on streets and in cafes. "When Claire died," Emery continued, his voice gentle, "I found a letter she'd written me. I haven't opened it. For 30 years, I've told myself I'm honoring her memory by keeping her last words sacred, but lately, I've been wondering if I'm just afraid that whatever she wrote might force me to stop editing my life and start living it again." Margot turned to face him, surprised to find him standing right behind her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you wrote in your book that at 30,000 feet, the truth feels safer. But sometimes, Margot, the hardest truths have to be faced on solid ground." Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. "I'm staying at the Bellamy Hotel, room 512. I'll be here for 2 weeks. Emery glanced at the manuscript on his desk, then back at Margot. "Chapter 7 can wait. I can't just leave in the middle of our session." "Yes, you can." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Some stories need to be lived before they can be written." Margot felt tears threatening to spill. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You've spent years collecting other people's courage," Emery said softly. "But maybe it's time to borrow some of it." In a moment of impulse, or perhaps clarity, Margot reached out and squeezed his hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, warm and solid and real. For a heartbeat, they stood there, connected by more than just ink and paper. "The memorial garden," she said suddenly, remembering his phone call. "That's for Claire." "Yes." His thumb traced a small circle on her palm before letting go. "They're planting roses. They were her favorite." "What color?" "Yellow." A sad smile touched his lips, like sunshine in winter. Margot gathered her things slowly, her movements weighted with decision. At the door, she turned back. "Emery, maybe it's time to read her letter." He nodded, his hand moving to touch the spot where she knew Claire's ring hung beneath his sweater. "Maybe it is." As Margot walked to the elevator, her phone felt heavy in her bag, laden with 20 years of silence and 6 months of possibility. Behind her, she could feel Emery watching, supporting her exit, just as he'd supported every word she'd written. She texted her father before she could change her mind. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Then, almost as an afterthought, she sent another message to Lucy. "Remember that passenger who said sometimes we have to break our own hearts to let them heal properly? I think I finally understand what she meant." Room 512 at the Bellamy Hotel felt like standing at the wrong gate in a familiar airport. Margot's knuckles hovered inches from the door, her reflection in the brass numbers showing a woman she barely recognized, someone braver, perhaps, than she felt. She'd walked this hallway 3 times already, each time turning back before reaching the room. But now, remembering Emery's words about stories that needed to be lived, she finally knocked. "Come in," called a voice that 20 years hadn't changed. Richard Ellis sat in a weathered leather armchair by the window, thinner than she remembered, his once dark hair now completely silver. He wore a cable-knit sweater that hung loose on his frame, and his carpenter's hands, the ones that had once built her childhood dollhouse, rested quietly on his knees. "Margot," he breathed, starting to rise. "Don't," she said quickly, remaining by the door. "Please." He settled back, nodding as if he'd expected this. On the table beside him lay a worn photo album, its edges softened by time. "You look like your mother. Mom died 4 years ago." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "Heart attack. I tried to reach you." "I know." He closed his eyes briefly. "I was a coward. Again." Margot moved to the window, needing to look at something other than his face. Below, New York traffic flowed like a river of light in the gathering dusk. "Why now?" "Because 6 months isn't enough time to earn forgiveness," he said quietly, "but it might be enough to say, 'I'm sorry.'" She turned to face him, finding his eyes already on her. They were the same shade of grey as hers, a detail she'd tried to forget. "Sorry for what exactly? For leaving? For missing every important moment of my life? For starting a new family like we were just a first draft you could edit out?" The word "edit" caught in her throat, making her think of Emery and his unread letter, of stories too painful to revise. "For all of it," Richard said, "for being too weak to face my failures, for thinking I could outrun my mistakes by making new ones." He gestured to the photo album. "But I never edited you out, Margot. I kept every newspaper clipping, every snippet I could find about your life. I know you became a flight attendant. I know you helped people find their way home, while you helped other people's children build birdhouses," she whispered, remembering the crafts he'd taught her step-siblings, their photos displayed proudly on his Facebook page years ago. "I have pancreatic cancer," he said suddenly, the words falling between them like dropped china. "Stage 4. The doctors say 6 months, I know." Margot wrapped her arms around herself. "That's about how long it took you to replace us, isn't it?" The moment the words left her mouth, she saw him flinch as if she'd slapped him. Something shifted in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first crack in a wall she'd built 2 decades high. "I found this last week," he said, reaching for a folded paper in his sweater pocket. "It's the only thing I kept from my old workshop." He held it out, a faded blueprint drawn in careful, childish strokes. Margot recognized it instantly. Her design for the ultimate treehouse, sketched on graph paper one Sunday afternoon when she was 11. Her father had promised to build it that summer. By fall, he was gone. "I never built it," he said softly, "but I kept it to remind myself of all the promises I broke." Margot took the blueprint with trembling fingers. Her handwriting was so young, so full of hope. "Daddy and Margot's super-secret treehouse. I have a book coming out," she found herself saying. "A collection of stories about people finding their way back to each other." "I know that too." A ghost of pride crossed his face. I follow Riverside Publishing's announcements. When I saw your name, that's partly why I came now. I needed you to know that even though I lost the right to be proud of you, I never stopped being proud." Margot sank into the chair opposite him, the blueprint crinkling in her lap. "There's this man," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "He lost his wife 30 years ago, but he still wears her ring. He has a letter from her that he's never opened. I keep wondering, what would make someone wait that long to read a goodbye?" "Fear," Richard answered simply. Fear that the words might change everything, or worse, change nothing at all. Like waiting 20 years to apologize?" He met her eyes steadily. "Yes, like that." A silence fell between them, not comfortable but no longer cutting. Outside, the city lights blurred as evening settled over Manhattan. Margot thought of Emery in his office, perhaps touching Claire's ring, perhaps finally reaching for her letter. "I can't promise forgiveness," Margot said finally. But maybe we can start with coffee, once a week, until, he agreed, understanding what she couldn't say. From his pocket, he pulled out a small card. "This is where I'm staying in Brooklyn. I moved here to be closer to my doctors at Sloan Kettering, and to be closer to—" "Okay," she whispered, taking the card. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emery. "Some stories take a lifetime to write. Take all the time you need." Chapter 7 will wait. Looking at her father's tired face, at the photo album full of snippets of her life, at the blueprint of a treehouse that never was, Margot felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Dad," the word felt foreign on her tongue. "Would you like to hear about my book?" His smile was careful, hopeful. More than anything. "It's about moments at 30,000 feet, she began, "when the ground feels far enough away to make truth feel safer." She paused, looking at the man who had taught her both the power and pain of goodbye. "Oh, but maybe some truths need to be faced right here on the ground." As she spoke, telling him about her passengers, stories of love and loss, of missed chances and new beginnings, she watched him listen with the same intensity he once gave to measuring lumber for her dollhouse. Outside the window, a plane's lights blinked across the darkening sky, another flight full of people carrying their own unfinished stories. Her phone buzzed again. "Lucy, this time, how are you holding up, storyteller?" Margot looked at her father, at the space between them slowly filling with words 20 years overdue, and typed back, "I think I finally understand why some stories take a lifetime to tell, and why some need to be heard before it's too late." The letter sat on Emery's desk like a time bomb, its ivory envelope yellowed at the edges from 30 years of waiting. Claire's handwriting on the front, "For when I'm gone," remained as clear as the day she'd written it, 3 weeks before cancer finally claimed her at 28. Rain drummed against his office windows, turning Manhattan into a watercolor of grays and blacks. Their usual Wednesday editing session had been postponed. Margot was having coffee with her father, their third meeting in 2 weeks. But she'd left him a note with her latest chapter revisions. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is read the words we've been afraid to face." Emery touched the silver ring hanging from his neck, a habit 3 decades old. The Memorial Garden Committee had called again that morning. They wanted to engrave one of Claire's quotes on the centerpiece bench. "Dad, but how can we choose her words?" they'd asked, "when her last ones remain unread?" A knock at his door startled him. Margot stood there, rain-dappled and slightly breathless, her coral umbrella dripping onto the carpet. "I thought you were meeting your father," he said, unconsciously moving to shield the letter from view. "I did. He told me about Mom's last days, about things I was too young to understand then." She stepped inside, closing the door. "And it made me think of your letter." "Margot, I know it's not my place," she continued, moving closer, "but Dad said something today that made sense. He said sometimes we keep old pain close because it feels safer than new healing." Emery looked at her, really looked at her. Rain had darkened her hair to honey gold, and her eyes held the same gentle understanding she brought to every story in her book. She'd become more than just an author he was editing. She'd become the reader he'd been waiting for. "Would you—" He cleared his throat, trying again. "Would you stay while I read it?" Something softened in her expression. Without a word, she set her umbrella aside and took her usual chair, close enough to support, far enough to give him space. With trembling fingers, Emery broke the seal that had remained intact since 1994. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent, covered in Claire's artistic scrawl. "My dearest M, if you're reading this, it means you've finally decided to stop editing life and start living it again. Yes, I know you, my love. I know how you'll try to revise the world into something less painful after I'm gone. I've been watching you these past weeks, seeing how carefully you handle me, like I'm a first edition that might crumble if touched too roughly. But my darling, that's not how books are meant to be read, and that's not how life is meant to be lived. You're probably wearing my ring right now, aren't you? On that silver chain you bought the day the doctor said terminal. I want you to know something. Love isn't terminal. It doesn't end with last breaths or final chapters, but it does change, like a story moving from one genre to another. I'm writing this from our garden, watching you plant the yellow roses you know I love. You're so focused on doing it perfectly that you've gotten dirt all over your favorite sweater. That's always been your way, caring so deeply that you sometimes forget to look up and see the whole garden growing around you. So here is my last request, my final edit to our story. Look up, M. The world is full of new chapters waiting to be written. Don't spend the next 30 years perfect binding your heart shut. That's a publishing joke, see? I learned something from all those nights listening to you talk about work. When you find someone who makes you want to write again, and you will, my love, because your heart has too many stories left to tell, don't be afraid to show them your unedited pages. Don't apologize for the ink stains on your fingers or the dog-eared corners of your grief. The right reader will understand that these are part of your story too. I'm not asking you to forget me. I'm asking you to remember me well enough to know I'd want you to write a new story, one with a different kind of happy ending. You always said the hardest part of editing is knowing when to let a story end and when to let a new one begin. So here's my professional opinion. As the great love of your first chapter, it's time for chapter 2. With all my heart, and with permission to share it again, Claire, P.S. Plant peonies next spring. I never told you, but I actually like them better than roses. The letter trembled in Emery's hands. He felt Margot's presence before he saw her move, her fingers gently taking the paper and placing it on his desk. When he looked up, her eyes were bright with tears. "She knew you," Margot whispered. "Really knew you." "She did." His voice was rough. "And she knew I'd wait too long to read this." "But you didn't wait too long," Margot said softly. "You waited until you met someone who made you want to write again." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Emery stood, walking to his window. The rain had softened to a mist, and somewhere beyond the grey buildings, he knew the memorial garden workers were preparing to plant Claire's roses. "I haven't written a word in 30 years, he said. "Not since her eulogy." "That's not true." Margot moved to stand beside him. "Every edit you make, every note in the margins of my manuscript, those are your words, Emery. You've been writing all along. You just needed Claire's permission to call it what it was." He turned to face her, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "And what was it?" "Living," she said simply. "You've been living, one red pen mark at a time." Without thinking, Emery reached up and unclasped the chain around his neck. Claire's ring caught the office light, spinning gently as he held it. "What are you doing?" Margot asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Looking up," he said, echoing Claire's words. "Seeing the whole garden." He moved to his desk and opened the top drawer, removing a small wooden box he'd bought 3 decades ago. Carefully, he placed the ring and chain inside, then set Claire's letter beside them. "Would you—" He paused, gathering courage from the ghost of Claire's laughter in his memory. "Would you have dinner with me? Not as an editor, not as a passenger in seat 4A, just as someone who might be ready for chapter 2. Margot's smile was like sunrise after a storm. Only if you promise to tell me about Claire, the real Claire, who preferred peonies to roses and made publishing jokes. Deal. He closed the box gently. But first, I believe we have a chapter to edit. It can wait, Margot said, touching his arm lightly. Some moments deserve to be lived before they're written. As they left his office that evening, Emery glanced back at the wooden box on his desk. For the first time in 30 years, its weight didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like permission to begin again, and somewhere, in a garden not yet planted, he could almost see Claire smiling, watching him finally turn the page. The restaurant was a small Italian place in the West Village, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. Margot stood outside, watching through the window as Emery arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table. He wore a navy blazer over a grey sweater, and his hands kept reaching for the spot where Claire's ring used to rest, a phantom gesture, like muscle memory learning to forget. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucy. "Your father's latest scan results." "Not good," Margot typed back. 3 months now, maybe less. She slipped the phone into her purse, took a deep breath, and pushed open the restaurant door. Emery stood when he saw her, and something in his eyes made her heart flutter, a mix of editor's precision and pure wonder, as if he was seeing both the story and the storyteller at once. "You look beautiful," he said softly, pulling out her chair. She'd chosen a deep blue dress that made her feel both brave and vulnerable, like ink spreading across blank paper. "Thank you for suggesting this place." She glanced around at the walls lined with vintage book covers. "It feels right. I used to come here with Claire," he said, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't." "Yes, you should," Margot interrupted gently. "She's part of your story, Emery. I want to know her." Relief softened his features. The waiter arrived with wine, and as Emery ordered for them both, remembering her preference for Pinot Noir from a casual mention weeks ago, Margot found herself studying his hands. They were steady now, no longer reaching for absent rings or phantom anchors. "Tell me about her," Margot said, after the waiter left. "Something that wouldn't make it into the Memorial Garden plaques." A smile tugged at Emery's lips. "She used to edit my editing. I'd bring manuscripts home, and she'd draw little flowers in the margins where she thought I was being too harsh with authors, called them grace notes." He looked at Margot. "I've been drawing them on your manuscript too. I didn't realize why until now." "I noticed," Margot said softly. "I thought they were stars. Claire would have liked that interpretation better." He took a sip of wine. "Now tell me about your father. How was coffee today?" Margot's fingers tightened around her glass. "He showed me pictures of his other family. His daughter, my half-sister, just got engaged. He won't live to see the wedding." "What's her name?" "Rebecca. She looks like him." Margot swallowed hard. "He asked if I would meet her. She's flying in next week to say goodbye, I guess." "Will you?" "I don't know. It feels like reading the last chapter first, you know, meeting someone just to lose them." Emery reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Sometimes the shortest chapters are the most important ones." The waiter returned with their food, handmade ravioli that smelled of sage and memory. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily between manuscript discussions and personal revelations, professional boundaries softening like butter on warm bread. "The publishing house wants to move up the release date," Emery said, watching her reaction carefully. "And they think your book could be their holiday lead title." "But that's only 2 months away," Margot said, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "We still have 3 chapters to edit." "We can do it." His confidence wrapped around her like a warm shawl. "But there's something else. They want to add a new chapter." "A new chapter? About us?" Emery's voice was gentle. "About the editor in seat 4A and what happened after. They think it would give the book a perfect narrative arc." Margot set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "But that story isn't finished yet." "No," he agreed softly. "It's not." Her phone buzzed again. A text from the hospice nurse her father had hired. "Your father's having a difficult night. He's asking for you." The words blurred as tears threatened. Emery noticed immediately, reaching for her hand. What is it? Dad's worse tonight. I should go. She started to stand, but Emery's hand tightened on hers. I'll come with you. Emery, this isn't how I wanted our first date to... Hey, he stood, already signaling for the check. Remember what you wrote in chapter 5. Love doesn't always arrive in perfect moments. Sometimes it shows up in the messy ones, wearing comfort like a well-worn coat. Margot stared at him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. You memorized that line. I've memorized a lot of your lines, he admitted, helping her with her coat. Hazard of reading your manuscript 17 times. The taxi ride to Brooklyn was quiet, Emery's hand steady in hers. Outside her father's brownstone, Margot hesitated. You don't have to come up. I know. He squeezed her hand. But Claire taught me something about showing up for the hard chapters. Richard was awake when they entered, sitting in his favorite armchair, but somehow taking up less space than he had yesterday. His eyes brightened seeing Margot, then crinkled with curiosity at Emery. Dad, this is Emery Caldwell, my editor. She paused, and more. Ah, Richard smiled weakly. The man from seat 4A. Emery's surprise must have shown on his face because Richard chuckled softly. She reads me her chapters during our coffee dates. I feel like I know you already. The feeling is mutual, sir. Emery pulled up a chair, while Margot perched on the arm of her father's chair, her hand finding his thin shoulder. Did you tell him about Rebecca coming? Richard asked Margot. Yes. And? Margot looked at Emery, drawing strength from his steady presence. I'll meet her. But Dad, I need you to tell me about her first. All the stories you should have been sharing for 20 years. I need them now. For the next 2 hours, they sat there as Richard talked about Rebecca's first steps, her love of carpentry just like him, her recent engagement. His voice grew tired, but his eyes stayed bright. Emery listened intently, occasionally asking perfect questions that kept the stories flowing. When Richard finally drifted to sleep, Margot walked Emery to the door. Thank you, she whispered, for changing our plans, for being here, for showing up for the messy moments. Yes, she reached up, touching his cheek softly. Emery, about that new chapter they want. We don't have to decide tonight. No, I mean, I want to write it, but not yet. Not until we know how it ends. He turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. Some of the best stories are written while they're still being lived. As she watched him leave, Margot thought about endings and beginnings, about fathers and daughters, about love that writes itself into the margins of grief. Her phone buzzed one last time, Lucy checking in. How was the date? Her friend asked. Margot looked at her sleeping father, at the empty doorway where Emery had stood, at the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming. And it wasn't the date I planned, she wrote back. It was better. It was real. Later that night, as she sat beside her father's chair working on her manuscript, she added a new line to the chapter about the editor in Seat 4A. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in grand gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes it simply sits beside you while you watch your father sleep, holding your hand in the space between one story ending and another beginning. The workshop behind Richard's brownstone looked exactly like the one from Margot's childhood. Tools arranged with mathematical precision, the scent of sawdust hanging in the air like suspended memories. She stood in the doorway, watching her half-sister Rebecca run her fingers along their father's workbench, tracing the grooves and nicks that told the story of two different daughters. He taught you too, Margot asked softly. Rebecca turned, and for a moment, Margot felt like she was looking at an alternate version of her own story. The daughter who got to keep their father, who grew up with his Saturday morning pancakes and workshop lessons. Everything I know, Rebecca said, picking up a worn chisel. He always said he learned from his mistakes with his first... She stopped, biting her lip. With his first daughter. Margot finished. It's okay. You can say it. The afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, autumn painted Brooklyn in shades of amber and loss. Their father was sleeping upstairs, the hospice nurse monitoring his increasingly labored breathing. I brought something, Rebecca said suddenly, reaching for her bag. "Dad doesn't know I have these." She pulled out a stack of newspaper clippings, slightly yellowed but carefully preserved. Margot recognized them, articles about her high school achievements, her college graduation, even a small feature about her first year as a flight attendant. "He kept them in his workshop in California," Rebecca explained, "in a box labeled Margot's Wings." She paused, twisting her engagement ring nervously. "I used to read them when I was younger, trying to understand this other sister I had somewhere in the world. You seemed magnificent, free." Margot's throat tightened. "I wasn't free. I was running from him, from everything he represented. Broken promises, unfinished stories." She touched a familiar chisel, remembering how it felt in her 12-year-old hands. "Did he ever tell you about the treehouse?" Rebecca's eyes lit up. "The one with the blueprint. He hung it in his workshop for years, said it was his greatest unfinished project." Before Margot could respond, her phone buzzed. Emery's name lit up the screen. "Final proofs are ready, but they can wait. How are you holding up?" The past few weeks had shifted something between them. After that first date, Emery had become her anchor, editing manuscripts together in her father's room, bringing coffee during long hospital nights, his hand steady in hers during difficult doctor's appointments. "She's here," Margot typed back, "in Dad's workshop." "There are so many ghosts here." "Emery," his response came quickly. "Remember what you wrote about the grandmother on the Tokyo flight? Sometimes strangers become family in the spaces where blood relatives left holes." "Actually," Margot said aloud, looking at Rebecca, "would you like to meet someone? He's been helping me write a different kind of story." Rebecca's smile was genuine. "The editor from Seat 4A. Dad told you. He reads us your chapters during his good days, said it helps him understand the daughter he missed becoming." 30 minutes later, Emery arrived, carrying 3 cups of coffee and a worn leather portfolio. He looked perfectly at home among the tools and sawdust, as if he understood instinctively that this space held more than just woodworking projects. "Rebecca," he said warmly, handing her a cup, "I feel like I know you from your father's stories." They settled onto workshop stools, the late afternoon light painting everything in soft gold. Rebecca pulled out her phone, showing them pictures of her California life, the furniture she built, her fiancé Sam, the woodworking classes she taught at the local community college. "Just like Dad," she said softly, then looked at Margot. "He always said you were the artistic one, though. Said you could see the shape of things before they existed. That's still true," Emery added, his voice gentle with pride. "You should read how she describes people in her book. She sees right to their core." Margot felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Their eyes met briefly, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them. "The book," Rebecca said suddenly. Would it be okay if I read the latest chapter? While we still have time to share it with him." Emery reached for his portfolio, pulling out the proofs he'd brought. Margot recognized his handwriting in the margins, not editing marks now, but small notes of appreciation, tiny drawn stars that might have been flowers. As Rebecca read, Margot found herself studying her sister's face, the way she bit her lip just like their father, how her fingers traced the words as if they were measuring lumber. Emery's hand found hers under the workbench, a quiet support as she watched her 2 worlds collide. "This is beautiful," Rebecca whispered finally, looking up with tears in her eyes. "The way you write about forgiveness, about how love sometimes needs decades to find its way home. Does Dad know this chapter is about him?" "Not yet," Margot admitted. "I've been afraid to show him." "Don't be," Emery said softly. "Andrigu, some stories heal in the telling." A noise from upstairs interrupted them, the hospice nurse calling down that Richard was awake and asking for his daughters. Both of them. Rebecca stood first, then held out her hand to Margot. Together, Margot looked at their father's tools, at the space between sister and stranger, at Emery, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they found Richard propped up in his armchair, oxygen tube beneath his nose, but his eyes bright with recognition. "My girls," he whispered. Both my girls. Margot sat on one side of him, Rebecca on the other. Emery hung back by the door, a respectful guardian of this fragile moment. "Dad," Margot said, her voice stronger than she felt, "I'd like to read you something." She opened the proofs to the chapter about forgiveness, about a father who kept newspaper clippings and workshop memories, about daughters separated by miles but connected by sawdust and DNA. As she read, she felt Rebecca's tears falling silently, saw her father's hand reach for both of theirs. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the soft beep of medical monitors and the distant sound of Brooklyn traffic. "You see me," Richard said finally, his voice rough. "After everything, you still see me. I see both of us. Dad, all of us." Later that night, after Rebecca had gone to her hotel and the night nurse had arrived, Margot walked Emery to his car. The workshop lights were still on, casting long shadows across the small backyard. "Stay," she asked suddenly. Not like that. Just, I don't want to be alone tonight." Emery's response was to pull her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I brought my editing pen. We could work on the final chapter. The one about us, about all of it. About how love writes itself in workshop dust and margin notes, in coffee cups and midnight readings. About how sometimes the best stories are the ones we're still living." Margot leaned into him, breathing in the scent of books and belonging. Through the workshop window, she could see her father's tools hanging in their familiar places, the chisels that had shaped two daughters' lives, the measuring tapes that had tried to span the distance between them. "You know what Claire would say about all this?" Emery murmured into her hair. "What? That some love stories need 30 years of editing before they're ready to be read." Margot smiled against his chest, thinking of unbuilt tree houses and unread letters, of sisters finding each other in the space between endings and beginnings. "Then let's write this one right," she whispered. "For Claire, for Dad, for all the stories that took too long to tell." Above them, a plane's lights blinked across the Brooklyn sky, another flight full of passengers carrying their own unfinished chapters. But for the first time in years, Margot felt no urge to escape into their stories. Her own, finally, was enough. The hospice nurse called at 3:47 a.m. "It's time," she said gently. "Dich, he's asking for you both." Margot was already awake, sitting in her father's workshop with her laptop open, trying to capture the right words for the final chapter of her book. Emery slept on the old leather couch nearby, his reading glasses askew, manuscript pages scattered across his chest. He'd been staying most nights since Rebecca arrived, the three of them taking shifts with Richard, editing chapters between morphine doses and oxygen tank changes. "Emery," she whispered, touching his shoulder. He woke instantly, eyes finding hers in the workshop's dim light. No words were needed. He'd been waiting for this moment too. Rebecca met them at the top of the stairs, her face pale but composed. She'd been sleeping in the guest room, calling her fiancé Sam each night to cry quietly about the father she was losing and the sister she was finally finding. Richard lay propped up in his hospital bed, morning stubble catching the soft lamplight. The oxygen mask couldn't hide his smile when he saw them all enter together. "My girls," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, "and the editor who helped us write our ending." Emery stepped forward, squeezing Richard's frail hand. "We're not quite finished yet, sir." "No!" Richard's eyes crinkled. "The best stories leave room for sequels." His gaze shifted to his daughters. "The workshop will take care of it," Rebecca promised, her hand finding Margot's. "No." Richard shook his head slightly. "Look behind the pegboard. A gift for both." Margot and Rebecca exchanged glances. "Now?" Margot asked. "Now?" The word was firm despite his failing voice. Emery stayed with Richard while the sisters made their way down to the workshop. The pegboard hung exactly where it had for decades, tools casting familiar shadows in the pre-dawn light. Together, they lifted it away from the wall. Behind it sat a wooden chest, beautifully crafted with two distinct styles of workmanship, evident in its construction. "Dad's work," Rebecca whispered, touching the intricate base. "And yours," Margot added, recognizing her sister's technique in the lid's carved patterns. Inside, they found two smaller boxes, each labeled with their names. Rebecca's contained a set of her father's favorite chisels and a leather-bound journal filled with sketches of every piece she'd ever made, but it was Margot's box that made them both catch their breath. Inside lay a perfect miniature treehouse, crafted to the exact specifications of her childhood blueprint. Every detail was there, the secret window, the rope ladder, even the tiny sign that read, "Daddy and Margot's super-secret treehouse." Beneath it sat a note in Richard's shaky handwriting. "I built it too late for the girl you were, but perhaps in time for the woman you've become. Some dreams take a lifetime to construct." When they returned upstairs, tears streaming freely down their faces, Richard's breathing had grown more labored. Emery stood back, giving them space, but Margot reached for his hand, drawing him closer. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Richard whispered, seeing the miniature treehouse in Margot's hands. "Rebecca, help me finish it. Last week." "It's perfect, Dad," Margot managed. "Like your book." His eyes found Emery. "You'll take care of her stories now." "All of them," Emery promised, his voice rough with emotion. Richard nodded, satisfied. Then, with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his failing body, he pressed something into each daughter's hand. "From your mother's garden," he whispered. "I kept them all these years." In their palms lay two pressed flowers, dried but still vibrant, preserved between sheets of glass. Margot recognized them instantly, the wild roses that had grown along their childhood fence. "Mom loved these," she whispered. "Like Claire loved yellow roses," Richard said, looking at Emery. "Sometimes we keep love pressed between pages until we're ready to let it bloom again." The room fell quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and Richard's increasingly shallow breathing. Outside, the sky began to lighten, painting Brooklyn in shades of promise. "Read to me," Richard asked. "The final chapter." Margot looked at her laptop downstairs with its unfinished words. "I haven't." "Then tell me how it ends." She felt Emery's hand tighten on hers, felt Rebecca's arm slip around her waist. In that moment, surrounded by the family she'd lost and found and chosen, Margot understood exactly how their story ended. "It ends with forgiveness," she began softly, "with a father who kept newspaper clippings and workshop memories, who built tree houses 20 years too late but exactly on time, with sisters finding each other in the space between heartbeats, learning that family isn't just blood, it's sawdust and stories and second chances." Richard's eyes drifted closed, a peaceful smile touching his lips. "And the editor," he whispered. "In seat 4A?" Margot looked at Emery, saw the future writing itself in his gentle eyes. "He teaches the storyteller that love doesn't end with last chapters, that sometimes the most beautiful stories are written in the margins of grief, in the spaces between what was and what could be." "Good," Richard sighed. "That's good." They sat with him as dawn crept into the room, Rebecca humming their mother's favorite hymn while Margot held his hand. Emery stood behind her chair, one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a manuscript page he'd found in his pocket. The scene where Margot first noticed the quiet man in Seat 4A. When the monitor's steady beep became a single tone, none of them moved at first. The morning light painted Richard's face in gentle gold, and for a moment he looked exactly like the father from Margot's childhood. Strong, present, complete. The hospice nurse slipped in quietly, turning off machines with practiced grace. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. Rebecca broke first, her soft sobs muffled against Margot's shoulder. They held each other, no longer separated by years or miles or different mothers' love. Later, as they sat in the workshop surrounded by the tools and memories of 2 lifetimes, Emery brought them coffee in their father's old mugs. "He died knowing he was loved," Rebecca said softly, touching the box of chisels, "by both his daughters. And that's the real ending, isn't it?" Margot looked at her laptop, at the chapter she'd been struggling to write. "But not just forgiveness, but understanding. Not just loss, but what we find in its wake." Emery sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. Claire's letter said something similar, that love doesn't end with last breaths or final chapters. It just changes genres, Margot finished, remembering. She opened her laptop, fingers finding the keys with newfound certainty. I know how to end it now. As she typed, Rebecca and Emery sat quietly, watching the story of a father, 2 daughters, and an editor find its way home. Outside, another plane traced its path across the dawn sky. But this time, Margot didn't need to imagine the passengers' stories. Her own, at last, had found its perfect ending, not in spite of its broken pieces, but because of how beautifully they'd been rebuilt. The bookstore's event space buzzed with anticipation. Margot stood backstage, watching through a gap in the curtain as people filled every chair. Rebecca was in the front row beside her fiancé Sam, wearing their father's old work apron transformed into a beautiful leather bag. Lucy sat next to them, practically vibrating with excitement, while the hospice nurse who'd helped them through those final days had brought yellow roses, Claire's favorites. Nervous, Emery's voice was soft behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 cups of coffee, a callback to that first flight that felt like a lifetime ago. Terrified, she admitted, accepting the cup. What if no one understands? What if they think it's just another collection of sappy stories? Hey! He set his coffee down and took her free hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Remember what you wrote about the grandmother on the Tokyo flight? Every stitch was a prayer for someone she hadn't met. Your words are like that too. They'll find the readers who need them. Margot squeezed his hand, noting how his fingers no longer reached for absent rings or phantom chains. Instead, they held her words, her heart, her future with steady assurance. The past 3 months had reshaped their world. After Richard's death, Rebecca had extended her stay, and together they'd transformed their father's workshop into a shared studio. Now, Rebecca flew in monthly from California to teach woodworking classes, while Margot wrote at their father's old bench, surrounded by the tools that had built 2 different daughters. The miniature treehouse sat in a place of honor on Margot's desk at home, home being Emery's brownstone now, where her books mingled with his on shelves that seemed to have been waiting for her stories all along. 5 minutes, the bookstore manager called softly. Margot took a deep breath, smoothing her coral dress, the same one she'd worn to their first date, now carrying different memories. Did you bring it? Emery reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. Claire's letter. Are you sure about this? It's part of our story too, Margot said softly, and stories need to be shared to be whole. The audience applauded as Margot took her place at the podium. Copies of Wings of Paper were stacked elegantly beside her, their covers showing a delicate origami plane against a sunset sky. But it was the dedication page that had made Emery cry when he first read it, for Richard Ellis, who taught 2 daughters that love can be built by hand, for Rebecca, who helped me understand that family isn't bound by time, for Claire, whose letter showed me that love never ends, it just turns the page, and for Emery, who taught me that the best stories are the ones we're brave enough to live. Thank you all for coming, Margot began, her voice steady. Before I read from the book, I'd like to share something else, a letter written 30 years ago by a woman named Claire to the man she loved, knowing she wouldn't live to see their stories end. In the front row, Rebecca reached for Lucy's hand. They both knew what this meant, the merging of all their stories into one. My dearest M, Margot read, watching Emery's eyes fill with tears at the familiar words. If you're reading this, it means you've finally decided to stop editing life and start living it again. As Claire's words filled the room, Margot saw their effect rippling through the audience. An elderly man wiped his eyes. A young woman in a flight attendant's uniform nodded slowly. A middle-aged couple held hands tighter. When she finished Claire's letter, Margot opened her book to the final chapter, the one about an editor in Seat 4A, a father's workshop, and a sister found in the space between heartbeats. Some people say love is about timing, she read, about finding the right person at the right moment. But sometimes love is about surviving the wrong moments until you're ready for the right one. It's about keeping your heart open even when it feels safer to edit out the painful parts. Later, during the signing, a woman approached with tears in her eyes. "I lost my father last month," she whispered. "Your words, it's like you wrote my heart." "That's because stories connect us," Margot said, thinking of all the passengers who had trusted her with their tales. "They help us understand we're never really flying alone." The line of readers continued, each one carrying their own unfinished chapters, their own needs for healing and hope. Rebecca helped arrange books while Lucy distributed tissues, and Emery stood quietly behind Margot's chair, his presence as steady as a lighthouse. When the last reader left, Emery pulled Margot to her feet and into his arms. "Claire would have loved this," he murmured into her hair. "All of it." "I know," Margot smiled, touching the spot where his ring used to rest. "She edited our story perfectly." Speaking of editing, Emery stepped back slightly, reaching into his pocket. "I have something for you." It was a small wooden box, clearly crafted in their father's workshop. Rebecca's quick intake of breath told Margot she'd helped make it. Inside lay a vintage fountain pen, its silver surface etched with a simple message: "For all our unwritten chapters, Emery, marry me," he said softly. "Not because our story is finished, but because I want to keep writing it with you, one page at a time." Margot looked at Rebecca's beaming face, at Lucy's happy tears, at the yellow roses that seemed to glow in the bookstore's warm light. She thought of her father's workshop and Claire's letter, of coffee spills and margin notes, of all the ways love writes itself into the spaces between endings and beginnings. "Yes," she whispered, then laughed. "But you know what this means?" "What?" "We'll have to add an epilogue to the book." "I think," Emery said, sliding a simple gold ring onto her finger. "That's the best kind of editing." Later that night, they all gathered in Richard's workshop. Margot, Emery, Rebecca, Sam, and Lucy. The miniature treehouse sat in the center of his old workbench, surrounded by tools that had built both furniture and family. Rebecca raised her glass. "To Dad, who taught us it's never too late to finish a story." "To Claire," Emery added, his voice strong and sure, "who knew love was worth the wait." "And to all the passengers in seat 4A, Margot finished, looking at the man who had changed from stranger to editor to the love of her life, who remind us that sometimes the best stories are the ones we didn't see coming. Outside, planes traced their paths across the Brooklyn sky, carrying hundreds of untold stories. But Margot no longer needed to imagine them. She had her own story now, not finished, not perfect, but beautifully, completely alive. And really, that was the best kind of ending, the kind that felt like a beginning. In her father's workshop, among the people she loved, Margot Ellis finally understood what Claire had meant in her letter. Love doesn't end with last breaths or final chapters. It just keeps writing itself, one heart at a time, in the margins of our most treasured pages. The end. We all keep untold stories in our hearts, just as Margot and Emery did for so many years. If you could turn back time and say something important to someone who's no longer present in your life, what words would you choose? What story would you want to rewrite? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Hopefully every moment, every detail in the story has brought you emotions, thoughts, and maybe a little joy or motivation. Thank you for spending time with us, and hope that the next stories will continue to accompany you and touch your heart.